Okay, so it's 2:02 now. Let me say a few words before you get started. So hello everyone, welcome to Ask Seminar series. I'm John's seminar co-leader. So I will be moderating a seminar with our communication specialist, Kathy Manley. So before we get started, I just want to let you know that this seminar is being recorded and we will post the recording on our YouTube channel. Please stay tuned. And I believe we will have two more in-person seminars this semester and a bunch of more virtual ones. So before the speaker gets started, our director, Naz Peter, also joined us, and I'll hand this over to Naz Peter to introduce the speaker. So please, Naz Peter, go ahead.
Thanks, John. And it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Christina Patricola, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Earth, Atmosphere, and Climate at Iowa State, and is an affiliate at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab also. So Christina got her PhD from Cornell, PhD in atmospheric science, and did a postdoc at Texas A&M, and she was with Lawrence Berkeley before then joining Iowa State, and she still maintains an affiliation there. Christina is going to talk to us about a very interesting topic, and I don't want to say a controversial one, but there's a lot of speculation around it. So we all know that the climate is changing and the world is getting warmer. There's more water vapor in the atmosphere. And very importantly for this topic, the SSTs are going through the roof in some of the areas, and that some people have speculated that that might lead to a lot more tropical cyclones or more intense tropical cyclones. Some have said, nah, it's really controlled by the dust in the atmosphere or by the wind shear. So there are several conflicting things at play there. So I learned a couple of things, interesting things, just from reading your abstract, and I'm not going to belabor that here. I am really keen to listen to what you have to say, because it is, as I said, it's a topic that it obviously has a tremendous impact. I mean, it's a big potential impact of climate change. So there's a lot of economic and societal interest in where this is going. So over to you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say about it.
All right, thank you so much, Lars, John, and Kazi, for having me and setting this all up. Okay, so I'm just going to turn off my video to make sure my audio stays stable. And hopefully people can still see my full screen. Let me know if not. Okay, sounds like that's working. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Christina Patricola. And today I'm going to talk about tropical cyclone frequency, the role of precursors, and the large-scale environment. I'd like to acknowledge my many collaborators, especially first authors Ron Kuski, who recently received his master's from Iowa State, Derek Danso, also at Iowa State, and Emily Burkos-Hickey at Berkeley Lab. I would also like to thank DOE for supporting this work through the Early Career Research Award, the Cascade Project, and NERSC. So let's start with the overarching problem. It likely comes as no surprise that tropical cyclones are a leading cause of fatalities and losses from natural hazards in the US, accounting for over $1.5 trillion in damages since 1980. Interestingly, the number of global TCs is relatively constant from year to year, as shown in this figure. There are about 86 or so TCs globally per year, with a standard deviation of only 10%. And a notable gap in our understanding is that there is no theory to explain global tropical cyclone frequency, as discussed in Sobel et al. 2021. On top of that, there's no consensus on how global numbers of TCs may change in the future. So this figure, which is from Knudsen et al. 2020, shows the spread from various future TC projections. And as you can see in the panel that I've marked with the red box, the future changes in global TC frequency actually span 0. So before digging into this problem, I wanted to review the conditions that are favorable for TCs for those who might not be TC researchers. So these include warm upper ocean temperatures to a depth of about 100 meters. And this is because TCs interact with the upper ocean. An unstable atmosphere and moist mid-troposphere to promote convection. Weak tropospheric vertical wind shear, since shear is detrimental to the organization of convection through dry air entrainment. And very importantly, a system of organized convection to provide a precursor disturbance, which I'll be calling a TC seed. And of note is that these conditions are often associated with local and remote sea surface temperature variability. So the overall objective of this talk is to understand the physical influences on TC frequency and characteristics by investigating 2 possible controls. So I'll be looking at TC seeds and the large-scale environment. And I'm going to present a collection of work that tests 2 hypotheses. One, that TC frequency depends on TC seeds, and 2, that TC frequency depends on large-scale ocean variability. So a bit of an outline here. I'm going to begin on the influence of TC seeds on Atlantic TC frequency and characteristics in the historical climate in models and observations. Second, we will systematically test the influence of TC seeds and TC seed strength and SST on Atlantic TC frequency. We'll then evaluate the relationship between TC seeds and Atlantic TC frequency in a future climate. And finally, we'll investigate the observed influence of ocean variability on global TC frequency. Okay, so starting off with the influence of TC seeds on Atlantic TC frequency and characteristics. Again, this is all in the historical climate. So this part of the talk is based on the publications listed below. And first, I wanted to give some background on the most common type of TC seed in the Atlantic, which is African easterly waves. So they are characterized by a trough of low pressure between around 850 to 600 hectopascals. They generate over the Sahel and propagate westward with a period of 2 to 10 days. African easterly waves peak during the Atlantic hurricane season, and notably there are many more AEWs, around 60 per year, compared to Atlantic TCs. So the TCs are not necessarily limited by the waves. African easterly waves have 2 kind of typical tracks, one north and one south of the African easterly jet, with TC genesis preferentially from the south track AEWs. And previous research has shown that the African easterly wave Atlantic TC relationship depends on the time scale. So there's a strong link on the weather time scale with about 85% of major Atlantic hurricanes originating from African easterly waves. However, there is a weak link on the seasonal time scale. So in our study from 2018, we ran mechanistic TC permitting regional model experiments that were designed to either prescribe or suppress African easterly waves. And this was done by placing the lateral edge of the regional model domain just off the coast of West Africa, as you can see in the figure on the left. And so by excluding North Africa from the model domain, because that's where the waves form, we could then control the African easterly waves that were prescribed into the model, while still allowing the model to simulate TCs in the Atlantic. So suppressing the waves was achieved by applying a 2 to 10 day filter to the tropical portion of the eastern lateral boundary condition, shown in the blue bar. And this time series on the right shows the meridional wind at 700 hectopascals at the location marked by the yellow star. And here we can see that the 2 to 10 day variability in the control which is the black line, has largely been removed in the experiment, which is in blue. So when we did this, we found that suppressing the African easterly waves actually produced no significant change in seasonal Atlantic TC number, which was particularly interesting given that the waves serve as the primary TC seed in nature. So this suggested that other types of seeds may serve in the absence of African easterly waves. And this work inspired the research that follows, much of which uses a similar method. So given that there are the two tracks of African easterly waves, which can exhibit different variability and future change, we pose the question, how does suppressing the typical Atlantic TC precursor, African easterly waves, by track influence seasonal Atlantic TC frequency? So we use similar types of regional model experiments as before, but applied the filter to the north track and south track after African easterly wave regions separately and together, which you can see in these green, pink, and purple bars on the figure. And we did this for 3 hurricane seasons using 10-member ensembles. And this figure shows the response in the number of Atlantic TCs to African easterly wave suppression for each experiment, with the stars denoting statistically significant changes. And so here we found that suppressing the African easterly waves in the south track and in both tracks together significantly increases Atlantic TC number by 30% or more. So this finding is particularly interesting given that removing the typical TC seed actually increased the TC counts. So then we went on to look at the large-scale environment to try to help explain this. And so this figure shows the change in 600 hectopascal relative humidity due to the south track African easterly wave suppression for each of the 3 seasons considered. And there's a consistent signal of substantially increased humidity in the eastern main TC development region that increases the favorability for TCs. And so what this is telling us is that suppressing the African easterly waves can actually lead to a more favorable TC environment. We then found a similar response in precipitation. And so this is suggesting that suppressing the south track African easterly waves can actually strengthen the disturbances associated with increased rainfall that may serve as TC seeds. Now, so far, the research I have shown was based on simulations with 27-kilometer grid spacing, which means that convection was parameterized. So this motivated us to investigate any sensitivity to the use of convective parameterization by performing similar experiments with the waves prescribed or suppressed, but using 3.5-kilometer grid spacing. So given the high computational cost here, we used a smaller domain shown on the slide, focused on the months of peak wave and TC activity, so August through October, and reduced the ensemble size to 3 members. So consistent with previous work, we found that the Atlantic TC climatology was still maintained in the absence of the African easterly waves. So specifically, we found that suppressing the waves led to no change in Atlantic TC number. However, we did find a westward shift in the TC genesis, which is shown in the left panel, and stronger TCs, which is shown in the middle panel. And we suspect that the TCs were stronger in the absence of the African easterly waves due to the fact that their westward shift tended to place them over regions of climatologically warmer SSTs, which you can see in the top right. So these results made us curious about the implications of TC seed type on TC landfall and impacts. So we first investigated this using observations from 1980 to 2022. In particular, we identified whether Atlantic TCs had African easterly wave or non-AEW origins based on NHC reports. And the bottom panels here show the TC track density from TCs with AEW origins in the reds and without AEW origins in purples. And you can clearly see a very big difference. The top left shows the TC genesis locations with TCs from the waves in red, and those were tending to form farther east. The top middle panel shows the TC landfall locations with the probability of landfall by latitude at the top right. And this is showing that TCs with AEW origins tend to make landfall further south than those without. And we also found, which is not shown here, that TCs from AEWs tend to be stronger and costlier than those that did not originate from AEWs. So this tells us that the type of TC seed is indeed important for TC landfall and impacts. So we then went on to address the question, how does suppressing African easterly waves influence Atlantic TC frequency, landfall, environmental favorability, and steering flow using large ensembles? So we performed regional model experiments with WRF at 27-kilometer grid spacing. And the initial and lateral boundary conditions were prescribed based on ERA 5. And while the 10-member ensembles were sufficient so far to address significance in basin-wide TC frequency changes, we needed the large ensembles to address significance in changes in TC track and landfall location. So for that reason, we ran 50-member ensembles. Another novel aspect of this work compared to what we had already done is that we performed the simulations for 5 hurricane seasons that represented 2 that were above average, 2 average, and 1 below average. And this was to understand any sensitivity to how favorable the TC environment was. So the domain on the left was similar to that from the 2018 study that I discussed previously. And again, this is so that we would have control over the African easterly waves prescribed through that eastern lateral boundary condition. And the control simulations were hindcasts of each of the 5 selected Atlantic TC seasons. Then the African easterly wave suppression experiments again applied the 2 to 10-day filter to the eastern lateral boundary condition over the latitudes in the purple bar there. And as you can see from the figure on the right, this largely suppressed the wave activity in the 2 to 10-day period. So we verified that that was operating as we intended. We tested 2 sets of parameterizations to select the one that best hindcasted the observed TC activity. And we opted for parameterizations that had positive biases in TC frequency, on average about 64%. And we did this because WRF had an eastward bias in the subtropical high that increased the tendency for TCs to recurve before making landfall. So given that bias in the subtropical high, the bias in landfalling TC frequency was only 25%. So we were pretty happy with that. We wanted to err on the side of having more TCs than fewer, since we wanted to specifically address the landfall question. So on to the results. Here we have the 50-member ensemble spread of Atlantic TC frequency on the top and landfalling TC frequency on the bottom. And what you can see here is that for each year considered, the distribution of the number of TCs and landfalling TCs is shifted towards greater counts when the waves were suppressed, which is in red, compared to prescribed, which is in blue. So we have that for each year. And then all the way on the right, we can see this very clearly that when the data for all years is aggregated together, we see that same result. So we then quantified this by taking the ensemble means. And we found that Atlantic TC frequency increased by 19%, while the landfalling TCs increased by 25% due to the African easterly wave suppression. And these increases were statistically significant for all years. And very interestingly, there was a tendency for landfalling TCs, TC increases to exceed the total TC increases in 4 of the 5 years. And so I'll explore why that was in a few slides. We also found that the increases in TCs due to African easterly wave suppression were greatest in July through September. So for this reason, our analysis that follows, looking at the large-scale response, focuses on these months. And like I had mentioned, one of the novel aspects of this work is being able to look at the spatial aspects of the landfall changes. And what we found is that suppressing the African easterly waves led to significant changes in the TC landfall, with increases over the Caribbean islands, southwestern Gulf of Mexico, Florida, and the southeastern US coast. So this figure is showing the change in probability of at least one TC passing through a 1 degree by 1 degree grid cell. And this was estimated using a Bayesian geospatial model. And anything that was statistically significant is hatched. And so here the reds indicate an increased probability of TC occurrence. And so you can see a whole lot of red on this figure. And this analysis, again, was made possible by having these large ensembles. So next, we wanted to understand why African easterly wave suppression led to a preferential increase in landfalling TCs, which could be due to changes in steering flow and or TC genesis location. So we looked at the changes in the steering flow due to the African easterly wave suppression on the left, and found that those were relatively weak. So that didn't really give us our explanation. But then the figure on the right shows the TC genesis counts binned by longitude. And here we can see in the red shading that the TC genesis shifted westward in response to the African easterly wave suppression. And this can help explain the increase in TC landfall because those TCs are then experiencing different steering flow than potentially if they had formed further east. We also wanted to understand how changes in environmental favorability contributed to the response in TC frequency. So on the left, the green shading is showing that increased 600 hectopascal relative humidity supported the increase in TC genesis. And this response was quite substantial and in a similar location for all of the years that we considered. On the other hand, vertical wind shear, which is on the right, did not explain the increased TC genesis due to the AEW suppression. The location and magnitude varied by year, and any decreases in shear did not consistently match the locations of increased TC activity. So some of you may be wondering, as we were, how do the TCs form in the absence of African easterly waves? So a study by Agui in 1972 documented an observed case of TC formation from disturbances shed by ITCZ wave breaking. And a similar phenomenon has been simulated in idealized models, for example, those of Wang and Magnus-Daughter on the right. And so in this figure here on day 5, you can see a positive lower tropospheric potential vorticity strip, which is shaded. By day 7, it begins to undulate and then breaks down into 3 vortices on day 9. So we hypothesize that ITCZ wave breaking can shed vortices that served as TC seeds in the absence of African easterly waves in our model experiments. So this figure shows the precipitation from July through September for each year that we simulated in the control on the top and the African easterly wave suppressed experiment on the bottom. And we can see that the ITCZ consistently shifts northward and strengthens in response to the African easterly wave suppression. And it's interesting to note that the increase in TCs with a northward shifted ITCZ in our simulations is consistent with results from aquaplanet simulations. So now we're going to dig into what is happening ahead of TC genesis. So first looking at individual TC cases, and then at composites of many cases. So this figure shows the meridional wind at 850 hectopascals at the time of TC genesis, which is the top left, and then going backwards in time to 105 hours before TC genesis. And this is one representative case from one of the control simulations. And what we can see is that a disturbance enters the model domain from the eastern lateral edge, where the African easterly waves are prescribed, around 60 hours before TC genesis. And this disturbance moves westward and eventually forms into a TC. And then here we have a case of TC genesis from one of the African easterly wave suppressed simulations. And this illustrates that TC genesis in the absence of the waves exhibits notably different behavior than in the control. So if we go back in time, we can see that the TC precursor does not enter through the lateral edge. Instead, around 48 hours before TC genesis, two vortices form from the ITCZ. Around 24 hours before TC genesis, one vortex remains, which later forms into a TC. So since this was based on individual cases, we wanted to understand how robust the behavior was. So to do this, we created composites of conditions leading to TC genesis using all TCs from all of the simulations. So we created a 5 degree by 5 degree box that was near the ITCZ. And this was a region in which TC genesis was common in both experiments. So what we were trying to do is capture a large sample size of TC genesis while still keeping the box near the scale of a TC so that the signals did not get averaged out spatially. And we selected a box that contained 174 cases of TC genesis in the control and 205 in the wave suppression experiment. And we tested and found that the results were insensitive to selecting other nearby boxes. So here we have composites of 850 hectopascal vorticity from the 174 cases of TC genesis that occurred over 40 to 35 west and 15 to 20 north. And similar to the figures we looked at before, the time of TC genesis is in the top left, and then the panels go back in time from there. The blue X's, which actually kind of just appear as a cluster of blue because there's so many TCs, mark the locations of TC genesis. So we can see that in the composite from the control, there's weak vorticity 105 hours before TC genesis. Around 84 to 60 hours before TC genesis, a disturbance enters through the lateral edge where the African easterly waves are prescribed, and that disturbance moves westward and forms into a TC. Now on the bottom, we have the same composites, but for the 255 cases of TC genesis in the African easterly wave suppressed experiment. So at 105 to 60 hours before TC genesis, there's a strip of vorticity near the region of the ITCZ. At 48 to 24 hours before TC genesis, the vorticity strip breaks down into two maxima, and then later the western vorticity max undergoes TC genesis. So the composites are suggesting that disturbances associated with the ITCZ wave breaking may be serving as TC seeds in the absence of African easterly waves. So to summarize this part on TCs and TC seeds, specifically Atlantic TCs and African easterly waves, we found that suppressing south track and both tracks of African easterly waves increased seasonal Atlantic TC frequency and enhanced TC environmental favorability in TC permitting experiments. Suppressing African easterly waves produced no change in seasonal Atlantic TC frequency in convection permitting experiments. Suppressing African easterly waves increased landfalling TCs in the Atlantic by 25% in large ensembles. And this was supported by increased relative humidity and a westward shift in TC genesis with minimal contributions from vertical wind shear and steering flow. And we found evidence that ITCZ wave breaking can serve as a source of TC seeds in the absence of AEWs. Knowledge of TC seed type and TC environmental favorability can inform seasonal prediction of landfalling TC activity based on results from both observations and models. And the mechanistic experiments that we've done are really nice because they allow us to isolate the role of African easterly waves, which helps to overcome this challenge of untangling correlation and causality in observations. All right, so now shifting gears slightly, we're still considering TC seeds, but bringing in SST. And in this part of the talk, we systematically test the influence of seeds and the environment on Atlantic TC frequency. But here we pose the question, what is the primary driver of Atlantic TC frequency? The characteristics of the seeds or environmental conditions? So we performed 10-member ensembles of regional model experiments with WRF at 27-kilometer grid spacing. And we focused on the 2002 hurricane season, which had near average TC activity for several reasons. Primarily, we wanted to be able to test the impacts of enhancing African easterly wave strength and warming SSTs. So we picked a season with only 3 TCs attributed to African easterly waves and with a cooler than average Eastern Atlantic. So the control simulation was a seasonal hindcast of 2002 with unaltered wave and SST conditions. Then we had 2 experiments, one in which the African easterly waves were strengthened, which we achieved by increasing the meridional temperature gradient over Africa in the initial and lateral boundary conditions. And this figure on the left is the eddy kinetic energy from the control, the stronger wave experiment, and the difference, showing that there was indeed an increase in the EKE associated with African easterly waves in the experiment. And in the second experiment, we warmed SST off the coast of West Africa by 1 degree Celsius. Okay, so on to the results. So these box plots show the TC counts and accumulated cyclone energy from the 10-member ensembles of the control in gray, the stronger AEW experiment in purple, and the warmer SST experiment in red. And we found that warming SSTs significantly increased Atlantic TC frequency in ACE by around 40%. I would say that's not too surprising. But then we also found that strengthening the African easterly waves led to weak and statistically insignificant decreases in Atlantic TC frequency and ACE. So this indicates that Atlantic TC frequency is driven more strongly by SST compared to the strength of African easterly waves. We then looked at the response in relative humidity on the top and vertical wind shear on the bottom. And we found that warming SSTs, shown in the right panels, significantly increased relative humidity and decreased wind shear over a substantial portion of the Eastern Main Development Region. And this increase in TC environmental favorability is consistent with the increase in TCs. On the other hand, strengthening African easterly waves, which is shown in the left panels, led to weaker increases in relative humidity over a smaller area and increased shear off the coast of West Africa between 10 and 20 north. So far the research I presented looks at the historical climate. So now we're going to explore the relationship between TC seeds and Atlantic TC frequency in a future climate. So the problem is that there's no consensus on the role of TC seeds in future TC frequency. And this problem exists in part because of a tendency for covariation in TCs, African easterly waves, and environmental conditions. And that can give the impression that TC seed frequency drives TC frequency. But we have to remember that correlation does not necessarily indicate causation. So based on our previous work, we posed the hypothesis that African easterly waves do not drive variability and change in TC frequency, that instead TCs and the waves are both influenced by the large-scale environment. So we will address the question, what is the relationship between AEWs and Atlantic TCs in a future climate? So to do this, we analyzed simulations from 3 models that participated in the high-resolution model intercomparison project, or high-res-MIP. These simulations were suitable given that they were run at TC and African easterly wave permitting resolution. And we considered 2 sets of simulations in terms of the treatment of the ocean, the uncoupled atmosphere only and the coupled atmosphere-ocean runs. For climate states, we analyzed the historical simulations from 1950 to 1980 and future simulations that were forced by a high greenhouse gas emission scenario from 2020 to 2050. And the simulated TCs and AEWs were identified using objective tracking algorithms. So this figure shows the relationship between future change in AEW counts on the x-axis and future change in Atlantic TC counts on the y-axis. So any points that fall in the upper right or lower left quadrants, which are labeled with the blue boxes, mean that future changes in the waves and TCs are of the same sign. However, we can see in several models, which I've labeled with red arrows and red boxes, that those models are simulating an opposite sign in the future TC and African easterly wave changes. So what this tells us is that the future changes in the number of African easterly waves poorly indicate future changes in the number of Atlantic TCs. Then the figure on the right shows the relationship between future changes in TCs in the black dots and African easterly waves in blue for the coupled simulations on the x-axis and the atmosphere-only simulations on the y-axis. So in some of the instances, which are marked by the red arrows, the future projections are of opposite sign for the coupled compared to the uncoupled simulations. So what this shows is that future TC and AEW projections are sensitive to the treatment of the ocean. All right, now in the last part of this talk, I'll present the observed influence of tropical ocean variability on global TC frequency. So the influence of tropical ocean variability on TC activity is very well understood regionally or by TC basin. For example, ENSO, the Atlantic meridional mode, and the Indian Ocean dipole are all useful for seasonal TC prediction in various basins. But here we pose the question, how does global TC frequency depend on tropical ocean variability? We used observations of annual TC metrics over 1980 to 2021 from IB tracks, including the number of TCs, and that's with and without the short-lived TCs, which are 2 days or shorter. The number of TC days, which is the sum of all days in which TC existed, and accumulated cyclone energy, which is an integrated metric that accounts for TC number, intensity, and lifetime. Then for the climate modes, we considered ENSO based on the Niño 3.4 index and the ENSO longitude index, or ELI. That's a relatively newer index that can account for variations in what people often call the flavors of ENSO. And then we also looked at AMM and the IOD through the dipole mode index. So we analyzed the rank correlations between the climate mode indices and the global TC metrics. So this figure shows the rank correlations with significant correlations labeled above or below the bars. And we found little relationship between tropical SST variability and the global number of named storms. Excluding the short-lived storms strengthened the correlations with ENSO and AMM, but did not always reach statistical significance. But we did find that ENSO and AMM drive significant deviations in the number of global named TC days and ACE. So here on the left, we have box plots showing the number of named storm days sorted by the bottom, middle, and top percentiles of each climate mode, with ELI in pink, Niño 3.4 in red, and AMM in blue. And then on the right is the same, but for ACE. And this shows that during La Nina, there is a tendency for fewer named TC days and decreased ACE, while during El Nino and the negative phase of the AMM, there's a tendency for more named TC days and increased ACE. Then next, we have the environmental favorability anomalies composited during the bottom percentiles of named storm days on the left and the top percentiles on the right, with SST, relative humidity, and shear going from top to bottom. So consistent with the previous results, there are SST anomalies characteristic of El Nino and negative AMM during the top years of named storm days, shown at the top right. And this is associated with favorable humidity and shear over much of the North Pacific in panels D and F. So it's important to keep in mind that the North Pacific tends to dominate the global TC signal since it accounts for about half of the global TC activity. And notably, Atlantic and North Pacific TC numbers are anti-correlated, with the Atlantic contributing only 15% to global TCs. Okay, so wrapping up with just kind of some conclusions and points for discussion. So we found that the most common Atlantic TC seed, African easterly waves, is not needed to maintain climatological TC frequency in mechanistic regional model experiments of the historical climate. And this provides evidence that TC seeds are not a primary influence on TC frequency. And this notion is supported by observations, synthetic TC track simulations, and aquaplanet simulations. For example, Aikihata and Saito in 2021 found no correlation between frequencies of TC seeds and TCs in each ocean basin in observations. Emmanuel in 2022 found that TC climatology is mostly controlled by regional environment. There's no definitive evidence that low amplitude weather noise controls TC climatology. And Vu et al. In 2020 found that aquaplanet simulations produced a nearly constant number of global TCs, regardless of the frequency with which a TC triggering mechanism was applied. That's not to say that the TC seeds are not important at all. We did find that the seeds influence the TC characteristics, including landfall, as well as the environmental favorability. We also found evidence that other types of TC seeds can serve in the absence of African easterly waves. Our simulations provide evidence that we're seeing disturbances from ITCZ wave breaking, helping to fill in when the easterly waves were suppressed. Then we also found that African easterly waves poorly indicate future changes in Atlantic TC number. So the future changes in the number of waves in TCs are of opposite sign in some high-res MIP simulations. And we also found evidence that environmental favorability is a dominant control on TC frequency. So in the systematic test of SST versus TC seed strength, we found that the SST dominated in driving TC frequency. And then we found that ENSO and AMM have some influence, not on TC number, but on the number of global named TC days. So then where do we go from here? We do still lack a theory for global TC frequency. But this research provides evidence that TC seed frequency does not play a primary role. So we can perhaps cross that one off the list. Aquaplanet simulations are showing some promise in this problem. They tend to simulate increased global TC frequency as the ITCZ shifts poleward. So that could be an interesting avenue to continue to make progress on this problem. And then we found in observations that tropical SST has some influence on global TC activity, but it's relatively small. So what are the other factors? Then speaking of ENSO, it is uncertain how ENSO and the tropical Pacific zonal SST gradient will change in the future. So we really do need improvements in climate model representation of the tropical Pacific in order to reduce uncertainty in future TC projections. And then future projections of African easterly waves are also uncertain. And as we showed, even though they may not be important for TC, for maintaining the TC climatology, the frequency, strength, and location of the African easterly waves are important for Atlantic TC characteristics. And then finally, I briefly alluded to this, but this is probably a whole nother talk. TC projections that include TC ocean interactions while minimizing ocean model biases are also very much needed to help kind of reduce some of the uncertainty in future TC projections. So I would just like to thank everyone for tuning in. Very happy to take any questions. Very special thanks to Dr. John Yang for coordinating the seminar along with Kazi and Lars for having me. So I will stop there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. Everyone should be able to unmute themselves. I see, Will, you already are unmuted. You ready to ask a question?
Hi. Let me see if I can get my video going. Thank you. A really interesting talk.
Thanks.
I was curious. I'm sure you've thought about the Saharan air layer as well and how that gets involved with the African easterly waves. Certainly, I mean, it seems possible anyway that the mechanisms that cause a high frequency of African easterly waves could also potentially cause larger infusions of Saharan dust into the tropical Atlantic. And I was wondering if your WRF experiments that you ran that suppressed the easterly waves on the eastern boundary conditions may have also affected the Saharan dust, which could have, of course, affected the relative humidity as well in the Atlantic.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question and a very important process in all of this. So let's see. Okay, so the version of WRF that we ran did not include a dust model. So I'm not so sure that we had any responses in dust that would have come with the suppression of the waves accounted for. But I'm very happy to say that we have since started collaborating with a group that has a dust model. And so we are going to be actually able to look at that specific mechanism as well. But that's a really good point.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Isaac, go ahead.
My name is Isaac Moradi. I work at the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office at Goddard. Of course, I'm a SIG employee, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And it was a very nice talk. So I mostly work on simulating microwave radar observations to improve the track and intensity of tropical cyclones. I have a couple of friends at AOML in Miami. They tell me if the early model forecast tells us that the cyclone is going through Miami, it makes us very happy because we know it's going to change. The models are not really good in giving you anything probably beyond 3 days or maybe 5 days forecast. We have seen that. I work with the NOAA HAFS, run the GFS model, run the NASA GEOS, and really beyond that point is the track intensity is not really reliable. So, and I know the results that you showed, it's kind of mixed between the models. How much do you really trust the model like WRF to do simulations for the future, a model that is actually being parameterized to work in the current conditions? So how much do you really trust these models for looking at the more climate scale simulations? And I understand that from a weather perspective, we are looking at the exact track and intensity. For a climate perspective, you are really more looking at the probability rather than the exact location. Thank you for your comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Isaac. So I would say that for considering the climate time scale using a model like WRF or really any other model, kind of the helpful thing is that we are considering the aggregated statistics of landfall. So in a way that may be simpler than trying to forecast the actual TC track for a given TC in real time. But having said that, I would say that the biggest thing that I would probably check for is to what extent there are large scale, kind of seasonal scale biases in the steering flow. Because if the subtropical high is positioned even just a little bit off in the model, that, like we found in WRF, can impact the tendency for the TCs to recurve too soon or maybe make landfall too much. And so I would definitely consider that aspect of the large scale circulation, both in terms of how well a model is simulating it in the historical climate, and then what kind of change are the models projecting for the future climate to try to help interpret landfall changes. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Oh, there's one in the chat. In your coupled simulations, did you look at the effects of other ocean quantities other than SST on TC frequency?
Okay, so let's see. So this must be referring to the high-res MIP part of the talk, since that was the only part where we were able to bring in simulations that had coupling with the ocean. In that part, so we looked just at the TC frequency and the African easterly wave frequency. But there is an additional study that I didn't have time to talk about today, where we looked at TC precipitation in the high-res MIP simulations and how including the ocean coupling or not impacted how the model simulated it or projected it into the future. That paper, oh gosh, I'm forgetting what year it was published in, the early 2020s. The first author is Huanping Huang. So that would be a good one to look at for other aspects besides TC frequency. And then I'm also excited about some research we have going with regional model simulations to try to systematically understand how inclusion of ocean coupling can influence TC projections. So in those simulations, so I didn't have time to talk about this this whole thing, but the global coupled models tend to have biases in tropical SSTs that have been pretty persistent across generations of the models. And some of our work has shown that these SST biases can end up impacting the quality of TC simulations. So, for example, decreasing Atlantic TC counts by half, which is not good, right? That's a big source of uncertainty when we try to make future projections. So that was what motivated us to use a regional coupled model that considers the mixed layer only. And it considers TCs on the scale, the time scale of an individual TC instead of climate length simulations. So essentially using what people call the pseudo-global warming or storyline approach to say we have a specific TC. In our case, we're looking at Hurricane Katrina from 2005. What if that TC occurred in a future warmer climate? We can perturb the initial and boundary conditions in the model accordingly, as well as the greenhouse gases. And in doing so, that helps mitigate these SST biases that are so detrimental to TC simulations. So that work is underway, but I'm going to be very happy to share more of that once we have results. So again, also please feel free to connect with me over email in case people want to keep in touch and discuss more, and I can also share other research as it becomes available. So thank you very much for the question, Maria.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. If anybody
I have
has any last
one.
minute. Oh, go ahead, John.
So what about the atmospheric parameters such as upper level oil core and some tropopause cooling? Are those something you are interested in looking into?
Yes, yeah. So for thinking about future TC changes, that is certainly going to be important. So yes, that's the short answer.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Great. Do we want one more last minute questions? Anybody have something burning? We have a couple, about a minute. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Christina, for giving us this talk, and thank you everyone else for coming and attending. This was really great. As always, a recording will be available on our YouTube channel this week. And our seminar series continues next week. Just as a reminder, we don't have one on Monday. No, I'm sorry. We do have one on Monday, but we also have one on Thursday of next week. I will remind you again on Monday. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks
Have a good
again
day.
for having me.